Has America moved past the legacy of secret and coerced adoptions? Gabrielle Glazer will be here to talk about her new book, American Baby. What happens at so-called tough love schools and wilderness programs for troubled youth? Kenneth Rosen will join us to talk about Troubled, the failed promise of America's behavioral treatment programs. Alexandra Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's January 22nd. I'm Pamela Paul. Gabrielle Glazer joins us now. She is the author of American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. Gabrielle, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Give us a sense of the scope of this book, because it is about a mother and a child, but it's also about a much larger story.
I tell the story through the narrative of my late friend David Rosenberg and his birth mother, Margaret Katz, and their lifelong search to find each other. But it really involves, I use their twin stories as a way to tell what happened to an estimated 3 million American women and their sons and daughters, their 3 million sons and daughters in the years after the war and before Roe v. Wade.
And who was David Rosenberg? You said he was a late friend of yours.
David was a cantor in Portland, Oregon, and I met him in 2007. I was a reporter for the Oregonian assigned to write a story about the kidney donation that he was getting for a friend. And I met him in a dialysis center where he asked me to interview him. And in the midst of the interview, he told me that he hoped the story would go viral. This was in the early days of YouTube, and I don't even know if Facebook was a thing yet, but stories were starting to get out there and go viral. And he told me, I hope this goes viral and that my birth mother sees it. And it was a thought that stayed with me for a really long time. I wondered, what did that mean for him? What did the story of having been, as he put it, given up imply? Was that really possible? I'm the mother of 3 daughters, and the very idea that a mother could surrender a child for adoption and not really have that impact her was beyond the realm of possibility for me. So in 2014, he called me. I'd moved from Portland back east, as we say, and I saw his name on my caller ID, and I knew he was sick. He was dying of cancer. And he said, I found my birth mother and she loved me all my life. And for him, it reversed this narrative that he had been an inconvenience, that he'd been somehow stood in the way of her and a better life. And while he had an incredible life with his adoptive parents who loved him very much, and he them, it didn't mean that he didn't have curiosity about his origins. And it certainly didn't mean that his birth mother, Margaret Katz, didn't wonder and think about her firstborn son every single day of her life.
How did he find her?
He took a DNA test. His wife, Kim Rosenberg, gave him a DNA test for his birthday, just to find maybe a little bit more about his medical history, his origins. And he matched with a cousin, a distant cousin, who happened to be an incredible amateur genealogist. And she was very dedicated to family histories. And she sent him an email that said, hey, cousin, can you tell me anything about great-great-grandpa Shlomo? And he wrote back and said, I'm adopted. I can't help you at all. You're the first blood relative I know outside my 3 children. I've ever talked to outside my 3 children. And she said, do you want to find your birth mother? I can help you. And she did. Within 3 weeks, she followed an amazing trail of clues. She worked around the clock. She understood that he didn't have very much time. And she turned up his birth mother miraculously on Facebook.
This brings up a whole big question around adoption that people probably who haven't gone through it themselves don't really understand, which is like, what is the difference between open adoption and closed adoption, and have the laws shifted on this? And it sounds like the whole 23andMe DNA genealogy trend has maybe changed this entirely.
It certainly has. And it's a wonderful tool for people who happen to be lucky enough to have sleuths in their family or to be able to match with a half sibling or a parent themselves. But not everybody is on these databases. Not everybody wants to turn over their saliva to a massive company. And the secrecy, just to back up a little bit, the secrecy began in the 1920s and 30s, mostly due to a social worker who worked out of Memphis, who was a baby thief, actually. She swooped through the South, snatching the babies of poor women and selling them to celebrities and wealthy people in California and New York. And through that, it's complicated, but through that began a culture of secrecy and laws that were enacted from state to state, actually 48 states, every state but Alaska and Kansas, that sealed the original birth certificate of a child and issued an amended birth certificate in its place, listing the child as the birth child of his adopted mother and father. And it made it sound as if this was, the original document. But what it did was, the export version of that logic was that it's going to shield the child from the taint of illegitimacy. And by the way, not all those children who Georgia Tan, that was her name, snatched were illegitimate. But regardless, the theory was it's going to shield the child from the taint of illegitimacy. It's going to protect the birth mother, if the child was born out of wedlock, from the shame of her wantonness. But most certainly, it would protect the adoptive parents from the threat of birth parents ever trying to interfere with their newly created family. And over time, that spread from state to state. And in the years after the war, there was a huge rise in unwed pregnancies. The sexual revolution was simmering. There was no sex education. There was no birth control. Men had come back from the war not celibate, and they were very unlikely to want to be celibate with their stateside girlfriends. And suddenly, there was newfound privacy for young people everywhere. The suburbs were booming. They had space in rec rooms. We can all remember those. And most importantly, in the backseat of the family Buick. But illegitimate births were so shameful that families sent their daughters away. Abortion was still illegal. And in the 20s and 30s, if you'd gotten pregnant out of wedlock, you would have had a shotgun wedding. But all of a sudden, there was a middle class to aspire to. And parents who were aspiring middle class people, or perhaps more educated, were horrified at their daughters who had this happen to them. They blamed them, of course. There was a huge double standard. And they sent them to a network of maternity homes that existed throughout the country.
Let's pause there. Of these out-of-wedlock births, which, as you said, tripled between 1940 and 1966, let's pause on one of them, David Rosenberg's mother, and just talk about the specifics of Margaret Katz's story.
Margaret Earle was the daughter of refugees from Nazi Europe and fell in love with her high school boyfriend, George Katz. They lived in Upper Manhattan, and they were sweethearts. George Katz's parents were Holocaust survivors who had been attorneys and had been wealthy in Vienna. Margaret's parents were much more working class. They were bakers. And this was not a union that George Katz's family approved of. Nevertheless, they were deeply in love, and Margaret got pregnant the first time they had intercourse. She didn't even know that that's what had happened.
How old was she?
She was 16. She was 16. And she thought maybe something was happening. Maybe it was the milkshakes that she was drinking after school. She used safety pins to let out her skirts, and she bought tent dresses, and she was a babysitter who took care of all the children in the neighborhood. Beloved. She's the most gregarious, courageous, sincere, funny woman you could possibly imagine. People loved her and sort of realized that she was pregnant, but not really. Her mother caught wind of it, noticed her daughter's changing body. Margaret fled for a few weeks at a friend's house in Queens, but ultimately she couldn't hide it any longer. And once it was clear that she was pregnant, Margaret's mother took her to a gynecologist in Midtown. And the gynecologist said to her, "Don't worry, we'll take care of this. We're going to send you to Louise Wise Services," which was the premier Jewish adoption agency in New York City at the time. You may remember it because it was also at the center of the triplets experiment. And at the time, all adoptions in New York State were aligned with the religion of the birth mother. If the birth mother was Jewish, if the birth mother was Catholic, the baby then went to either Jewish or Catholic parents, respectively. And he also said, "All right, well, you're pregnant, but come back to me when you're married and pregnant a second time, and I'll take care of you again." And she didn't know what that meant, but what it actually resulted in was the fact that he falsified her second child's birth certificate to note Margaret as a first-time mother, which is actually a federal crime to fool around with a vital document that's actually, birth certificate is pretty outrageous. But anyway, the culture of secrecy was so vast and intricate that it extended even to this. This isn't in the book, but a woman who is in the book and is an adoptee rights activist in Texas named Shauna. Her birth grandmother staged a funeral for her and actually placed a headstone in the family plot outside Houston, if you can believe that. The shame of an unwed birth was so profound, and it's hard to, it's like gay rights. It's hard to convey to younger people. People used to have to live their lives in the closet, and this was another big secret.
Speaking of the shame around all of this, I mean, what happened when Margaret gave birth?
So Margaret was at a maternity home that was secluded in the woods in Staten Island. And when she went into labor, she still had to do her chores. She had to finish her sweeping chores, spent the night laboring alone. And the girls had no idea what was happening. They were not told what labor was going to be like. They were not told, what to expect during childbirth. They just heard these, this rumor mill from the other girls who may have given birth already. She was sent in a taxi to a hospital where she gave birth alone. She was strapped down. She was knocked out.
This is a twilight sleep of the time.
Twilight sleep of the time, which was actually a horrific combination of drugs that made women both agitated and amnesiac. So she was knocked out. And when it was time for her to push, they sort of released that. And she said, "Can I see my baby? Can I hold my baby?" She knew that he was a boy, that he was healthy, that he weighed 6.5 pounds, and that he'd been born at 6:35 p.m., but she wasn't allowed to hold him. And she said, "Please let me hold my baby. Let me hold my baby." And the nurse in the delivery room said, "You're one of the girls from Lakeview. You don't get to hold your baby."
One of the things that struck me so much, they're just these really painful moments in the book, but that Ephraim and Esther Rosenberg, who adopted her son, David Rosenberg, and we're loving parents and all of that. But the sort of unintended consequences of all of this, that in telling David Rosenberg that he was their chosen child, he then made the assumption that his mother did not choose him.
Exactly. And that was really part of the ethos of adoption at the time. And I don't think that the Rosenbergs, who adored him, had any intent other than to reassure him. But what adoptees feel when they hear that is exactly what you said. I was rejected by my birth parents. There must be something so wrong with me.
I want to go back to Louise Wise Services. You just mentioned that people may be familiar with this agency because of their triplets experiments and their twins experiments. I think many people are familiar with the film, the documentary that came out a few years ago, Three Identical Strangers. And weirdly, just a few podcasts ago, I mentioned a book called Identical Strangers by Paula Bernstein and Elise Shine, they were also a case of Louise Wise. What the agency did in terms of falsifying that birth certificate was just the beginning. I mean, tell us a little bit about what else they did in the experiments that they did on twins and triplets.
Well, with twins and triplets, they separated them in order to try to weigh the effects of nature versus nurture. And, as many of us know, the results of that study are sealed until 2066, I think. It's highly unlikely any of us will ever see them, and what the true aim of that experiment was. And they separated them, intentionally put them with families of different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I guess to see, okay, what's it going to be like if you were raised in the home of a teacher versus what's it going to be like if you were raised in the home of a wealthy lawyer in Westchester. That involved dozens of multiple siblings, but they really were involved in so many more sinister experiments, including one I discovered that was government funded for 15 years. Louise Wise sort of pioneered the notion of matching an infant to the right parents in a way that was going to be sort of better and more scientific than what Mother Nature could provide herself. And there were theories, this incredibly harebrained theory by a pediatrician on Louise Wise's staff named Samuel Karelitz, who believed that the babies who cried the most were the most intelligent. And how do you measure? Yeah. And it began in 1957. All right. So the theory was that the babies, who cried the most were the most intelligent. And in order to measure that, first they ruled out heat prods on new baby's skin. They ruled out electric prods on new baby's skin. And they came out with a rubber band gun that delivered really heavy blows to the foot of a 10-minute-old newborn, all the while measuring the whales. And this experiment was funded by the NIH for 15 years, and it involved untold thousands of babies throughout the New York area. And it was even in the popular press. Joyce Brothers, I think some of us remember her, hailed it as a wonderful tool to reassure parents, okay, if you've got a colicky baby or if you've got a whaler, he or she's going to turn out to be smart, so don't worry.
And they did this only with babies that were being given up for adoption?
Exactly. And one thing that's important to note is that the United States government had signed the Nuremberg Accords, which demanded informed consent for patients after, of course, the horrors of the Holocaust and the medical experiments we all know happened during that. And this really shocked me because this was a Jewish agency, and I'm Jewish, so it horrified me. It's horrifying no matter who you are. But this was a Jewish agency conducting horrific, sinister, pseudoscientific experiments on Jewish babies more than a decade after the United States had signed this agreement, saying that informed consent was the first precept of any medical experiment. And these babies were under the custody of Louise Wise Services. So they were the custodians of these babies and just said, yeah, go ahead, go for it.
This brings me to a final question. Earlier, you mentioned the adoption rights movement, and hearing this, you can kind of understand one of the reasons why that might have started up. But tell us a little bit about the origins of that movement, what the goals are. And I'm assuming that all has not been fixed with the systems around adoption and practices. So what also needs to change?
The adoptee rights movement really began in the 1970s, and its efforts really center around giving adoptees open access to their original birth certificates. And the fight has been long and arduous, and only 10 states allow adoptees complete open access to their birth certificates. It's complicated, of course, but the efforts are ongoing in 40 other states, including the big states of Texas, California, Florida, where grown men and women do not have, I can't say this strongly enough, grown men and women do not have the ability to go to the courthouse in the counties in which they were born and obtain the document that reveals their original identity. And you were saying earlier, that DNA sort of has upended that. It doesn't obviate the fact that the laws remain unequal in the vast majority of states still for adoptees.
Obviously, still a lot needs to happen in this area, and there's a lot more in the book. The title again is American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption by Gabrielle Glazer. Gabrielle, thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Kenneth R. Rosen joins us now from outside Milan. His first book is called Troubled, The Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment Programs. Ken, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. This should be fun.
I should say that you are a former Times staffer, and I had no idea when you were at the Times that this was part of your background, because this book is a personal memoir in addition to a larger investigation of the tough love industry. So let's just begin there. What is the tough love industry? What do we mean by that phrase?
It's a group of several types of therapeutic programs aimed at teenagers specifically, and they run the gamut from wilderness therapeutic excursions. They have therapeutic boarding schools, and then residential treatment centers that could be sort of a equine therapy or on a ranch somewhere. And they aim to take wayward teens and turn them around, right? Keep them out of juvenile delinquent centers and juvenile delinquent halls with the hopes of returning them back to a normal high school or their original high school. It's just not always seeming to work that way. It oftentimes ends up making them much worse off than before.
Okay, you'll have to explain that, because sort of on the face of it, I think probably especially now that we're all locked down in quarantine, equine therapy, being in the mountains, wilderness camp, that doesn't sound so bad.
No, it really doesn't. And I write in the book that on paper, some of the days seem very innocuous, right? You hike all day, you have lunch, you have therapy, and then you do it all again the next day. It's just this sort of continual abrasion, sort of like a cult indoctrination that really burrows into you and ruins a lot of children. For instance, we had to write a journal every night at the wilderness program that I was in order to get dinner. And if we didn't do it correctly, we wouldn't get dinner, and we were meant to rewrite it until it sounded more therapeutic or more incisive into how bad we were or how terrible we had been to our parents. So there's little things like that made otherwise bucolic, wonderful areas damning.
This is different from military school, for example. Like when I was growing up, you sort of, kids got sent off to like military school if they were really problematic. Problematic is probably a problematic word, but there you go.
Yeah, they were problematic. Well, it's better than troubled, I think.
Let me put that in quotes, quote unquote, problematic. All right.
I actually went to a military academy when I was younger, and that was for a totally different reason. And that experience was far and away from what I experienced at these programs. And we have to preface it by saying that therapy is important, but the way these children are introduced into therapy is concerning, and that is by being taken in the middle of the night by two transporters, they're called escorts, who come and just whisk these kids off the programs in the middle of the night while they're sleeping against their will. And I think introducing anyone to therapy in that way is not beneficial. And I don't know how anyone could live past the trauma of a night like that to then sort of visit their internal thoughts and say, how can I improve? How can I be better when they're dealing with something so crazy?
Why do they whisk people away in the dead of night? I mean, why not just say, all right, time to go, get your bags, let's drive off?
Right. I mean, that would be ideal, right? If a kid wanted to go to these programs, but all the professionals who advise parents on these programs and what to do with a troubled teen say that, look, if they find out they're going to go to a place like this, there's a high chance that they're going to run. And if there's a flight risk, we don't want to put those children in danger. So the best way to handle that is to surprise them and take them. Now, not everyone was transported in the middle of the night. I was. Many of the people who comprised the narratives of the book were taken in the middle of the night, but some were just bribed, said, we're going on a shopping excursion, or maybe if you just go to this program for 20 days, we'll bring you home and everything will be okay. So there were some lies in the mix there too.
Why did you get sent or dragged off to a wilderness program in 2007?
I was rebellious, Pamela. I was just taking my mom's car. I was not listening to authority figures. I would never go to school. I didn't ever go to class. I was using recreational drugs. I was drinking alcohol, and it was a tough time for my mom. She was going through a divorce. She had to look after my sister and me, and I was just running amok in the house, outside the house. She was hearing things from police, from community officials about my whereabouts and what I was doing, and she really couldn't figure out a way to bring me back down to earth. And when someone told her that there were programs that could do that, if she just managed to send me away, she found that as the best option.
All right, this was 2007. How old were you then?
I was 16.
Now that you're far older and more mature, looking back, knowing what you know, what would you have done if you were her?
I am the father of an infant and a toddler, my son and daughter, and the thought terrifies me of having to relive this, of knowing that the teenage years are really rupturous and everything in that time frame is really difficult. And I don't know what I would have done. I think that all I can say is I don't place any blame on my parents for choosing this path for me. I was difficult. I needed help. I'm just not convinced that this was the answer. I only now looking back, I mean, like we said, in the middle of it seemed like the only way.
What this was actually three different programs. There was a residential treatment center in Utah, a therapeutic boarding school in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, and an outdoor therapy program in New York in the Adirondacks. Were they all sort of a piece? I mean, if one didn't work, why did your parents decide to send you to another? Is it supposed to be a kind of outward bound meets therapy meets military or disciplinary treatment? What's the idea?
It's a remove from society. You're supposed to be, in a perfect world, you're supposed to be removed from the harmful environments that are causing these issues among the teen or the family, and then brought back to the centering of yourself to then go back to your high school and flourish there. Problem is that a lot of the techniques used at these programs, yes, they're in the Berkshire Mountains. Yes, they're in, Death Valley in Utah, Moab, beautiful. But the problem is that they use these, restraining tactics. They use attack therapy in which you sit in a group and basically yell at people for feeling one way or another or having done something wrong. They withhold civil liberties. You're not allowed to eat if you do something wrong. You can't go outside if you do something wrong. You can't talk to someone. Sometimes you can't talk to anyone for weeks at a time. In instances of kids that I interviewed for the book, they were placed in solitary confinement. It looks nice on the outside, and that was the easy way to fool parents into saying, oh, this is sort of like a prep school, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And then you're, again, like you noted, shuttled through three different types of programs. If it really was therapy, then why do you need this many different types of exceedingly worse programs in order to get there?
When did these programs begin, and how widespread are they?
It seems that they had began in the late 70s, early 80s. There's some questions as to what gave rise to these programs, whether it was a cult, whether it was a rehab in LA that sort of took people in and kept them as an inpatient program. But they really grew in popularity in the early aughts, and then again in the aftermath of the recession. There are dozens across the country, hundreds across the country in all 50 states that cater to not only children within the state, sometimes foster children, sometimes just private families who are seeking treatment, but also out-of-state children. So there's been an issue recently in Oregon and Michigan in tracking those children to where they're going to these service providers that are not necessarily in-state. You got Oregon kids being sent to Illinois or Utah, and there's no checks or balances on a system like that.
How much are these programs regulated? And you mentioned some of them are private, some of them are, it sounds like either fully state funded or at least in part state funded. How controlled are these? How regulated are they?
They've settled themselves in states that have very lax efforts for accountability. In Utah, there's very little regulation. And by little regulation, I mean there's no transparency. There's no filing of reports. There's no access that legislators have or investigative units have to get into these programs. Oftentimes, they chalk it up to HIPAA laws. Like, look, we have, adolescent kids and we can't necessarily disclose all the information. It seems now that following Paris Hilton's documentary on her own time in a program in Utah that investigators are making headway into learning more about these programs. But at present, despite all the evidence to suggest that physical, emotional, and sexual abuse occur at these programs, rarely do states take any action.
Sorry, did you say Paris Hilton?
Yeah, Paris Hilton was a client at a school called Provo Canyon School in Utah back when she was a teenager as well.
Okay, that's an interesting word you chose, client. Wouldn't they be students or patients?
So there's a lot of children from these programs, former clients that I like to call, refer to themselves now as survivors, and I just don't think it's accurate to call anyone a survivor of these programs, merely because so much of what happens at these programs lingers into adulthood, arrested development, people with increased anxiety or depression or diagnosed with PTSD, that there's no one that's really survived yet. Everyone's still dealing with the fallout of these programs. But I can't say student either, because not all of these schools were like accredited high schools. You couldn't get a high school degree there. I mean, there was one in upstate New York, Academy at Ivy Ridge, that shut down. I think it was Elliot Spitzer who shut it down because they were giving out fake diplomas. So you can't really call them students either, because they're more or less clients in therapy.
What was a typical day like for you in one of these programs in terms of classes or work or outdoor exercise?
It's tough to say because they're so different. Each one was so different. But all I could say that everything was focused around therapy. Anything you said was psychoanalyzed. Anything you did was psychoanalyzed. Everything that you tried to do, a hike, carving out a spoon, there was some hidden therapeutic meaning to it that you needed to assess and then articulate. They would stop us on a trail in the wilderness program, and we'd have the truth circle, right? And we'd have to say all of our feelings. And if someone had told us something on the side that might have seemed like they wanted to run or that they were scared, or we had to tell on them and say, like, so-and-so is feeling this way and they're planning on doing that. Or at the residential treatment center, there was physical abuse that I don't want to go into. It's in the book that characterized why so many people were just literally walking through their days silently or standing against the wall and staring into it, hoping that this experience will just wash over them. But again, by and large, you look at it on paper like, okay, they're going to lunch, they're going to therapy, they have maybe one class and then an individualized therapy session. It doesn't seem that bad. But all these stories that are coming out now are saying that there was abuse or that they felt that they were abused, at least warrants looking at, I think.
I guess forcing adolescent boys to talk about their feelings that much is a certain kind of abuse, but you're saying, but I do have to ask, there was physical abuse as well?
Yeah, and there was a lot of physical abuse that I had witnessed at the military academy. That was under different auspices. It seemed more like, I don't know, male bonding. But this was physical abuse that ranged sort of like into fight clubs, into... There's a technique where you put your shoulders and your knees and your toes and your nose against a wall and you stare at it for hours, some like disciplinary move. And it's meant to make sure that you don't pass out from locking your knees if you were to stand against the wall. So there's this treatment that's meant to subdue children, to say nothing of all the drugs that people were given, Suboxone out to wazoo, just to knock kids out or put them to sleep at night.
How did you go about reporting this book? Because you didn't write just about your own personal experience. You do profile a number of kids who've been in or maybe still are in some of these programs.
I knew I wanted to bookend the book with my experience, but in the middle there are 4 students who are of the 100 or so interviews I conducted in order to pull together the narrative. I went about first interviewing former clients that I knew at these programs and then followed their recommendations to other kids that they had connected with over the years and pulled together a tapestry of the industry that I thought was representative of just the general trajectory of the student. So the children I selected for the book show that same wilderness to residential, to lockdown, and then to later problems in life.
And did you try to get people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different reasons for why they were there, different kinds of programs that they were in?
Yes, yeah. I feel, or at least I ventured and hope I succeeded in covering all the different types of programs, and then several different types of backgrounds for the students, different class upbringings, different socioeconomical levels, and also different family lives. But by and large, all the narratives were the same, which is one of the reasons why I felt comfortable choosing the 4 people I did for the book, was that the family life was always a wreck. There was always the same narrative of my parents were going through a messy, nasty divorce, or, there was sexual abuse at home, there was physical abuse at home, or my mom was doing drugs, or my dad was, abusing my brother and I had to witness that, or any number of terrible stories. But it always started at the home. And I think that what I've learned just by talking about this in all these interviews is that there's no chance that you can shut down $1 billion industry. And that's what a lot of the former clients are seeking to do. But I think we need to shift focus and look at the family unit and taking care of the home life before blaming it on just the troubled teen.
Well, you just said $1 billion industry. So, how much does it cost to send a kid to one of these programs?
It's the equivalent of an Ivy League education, easily $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a semester.
Going back to the 4 people you profiled, let's just talk about one of them quickly. And I'm going to just say, let's say Hazel. Who is Hazel? I'm assuming that's a pseudonym.
Mike and Mark are the only ones who allowed me to keep their names on the record. Hazel came from a difficult family life. She didn't come from a family where the father was ever present. He was oftentimes locked up or in jail while the mother was using amphetamines. She was subjected to a lot of moving as a kid. She never really had a family life. She was often in the back of a car, which was being driven by her mother, who was high. She was told that she couldn't have contact with her dad once he got out of prison because he was a bad influence, while meanwhile her mother was at home drinking. And they had lived in an area of New Jersey that was one of the most violent areas in the state at that time in the early 90s. So when the grandparents came to take her under their protection, they discovered that she was very troubled, that she had a lot of issues, that she was being rebellious, that she was using drugs as well, and decided that she was a troubled teen, that she was the one with the issues, rather than saying the treatment needs to come back to the home, that we need to provide a safe environment in which she feels comfortable returning after having been raised in such a tumultuous life.
Did you interview administrators and teachers and parents as well as the kids who went through the programs?
Absolutely. Yeah, I spoke with a lot of the former therapists who treated children at these programs. I spoke with my own therapist who was at my therapeutic boarding school. And I spoke to the parents of the characters in the book to see how they felt they did in sending their children away.
And overall, what was the sentiment, or did it vary? I mean, did people have regrets? Did they say, you know what, in the end, it was the only thing we could do?
Yeah, the parents always had the same story, which was, look, we want to put this behind us. We understand that this is how our child feels about it now, but everything's better now, or we've tried everything we could and it's not better now, right? There's just one or the other response, and it was sad to hear the ones that said we tried everything and still it hasn't worked, because this was the one silver bullet that was sold to the parents that was supposed to fix everything, that was supposed to be the cleansing that they needed at an early age to prevent any later trauma. It just didn't work out that way. The therapists, on the other hand, seemed to be more defensive and said, well, we were told to do this and we did our job, and you were a difficult case, or the children that we had to care for were difficult, so we did what we could with a difficult situation. And then lastly, the education consultants, who are the advisors parents meet with to decide which programs to send their children to, they were not responsive. They didn't want to talk about how they got into the industry or how they decided on which programs to send children to. But the one I did get to speak with was the one my parents used, and he hadn't known that I was one of the clients he forwarded or shuttled to these several programs. And I asked him, would you have suggested this school, the Academy in Swift River, to any parent? He said, oh, no, absolutely not. I would have never done that. And then that's when I revealed to him that I was one of those kids he sent to that program. And I think it sort of shocked him.
Why?
Because the program shut down after several years. Abuse allegations, the Massachusetts State Police were investigating sexual assault, and he had tried to wipe his hands, I guess, of having been associated with that program, and learned that, well, I still, I guess, remembered.
All right. Last question. Here you are, former New York Times staffer and senior editor at Newsweek, married, father of two, living in northern Italy, author of your first book, and you survived these programs. Do you think you are where you are because of that? Because you were sent away to these programs, or in spite of it?
I think it's in spite of it. I guess you could look at it both ways, but I am choosing to believe that's in spite of it, that because for so long I was made to feel that I was worthless, that I was wrong, that I was troubled, that I was damned to be bad forever, that nothing could fix me because I was inherently broken. I had to and continue to try to prove that that's not the case. I strive to get to the Times. I strive to get to publish this book. I continue to pursue all these things in the hopes that I can somehow prove to myself that I was not worthless, that I was not troubled. And again, a lot of interviewers, as yourself, have made clear, I have a life that seems very good, that I turned out okay. I don't necessarily feel that way inside. And until I reach some other point, some other level of happiness, then I'm just going to keep striving to put that past behind me. But it's like it's always catching up with me anyway.
You can hear the lingering effects of all of those enforced therapy programs. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Kenneth R. Rosen's first book is called Troubled: The Failed Promise of America's Behavioral Treatment Programs.
The dawn is hours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one.
That was Amanda Gorman, the inaugural Youth Poet Laureate, reading from her poem, The Hill We Climb, which she read at Joe Biden's inauguration. Alexandra Alter profiled Gorman and interviewed her, joining us now to talk a little bit more about that. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So this was a really exciting week in Washington, but what I most loved about the news events this week was that a poet was the breakout star of the inauguration ceremony on Wednesday. Amanda Gorman was the youngest inaugural poet in U.S. history. She joins a very elite class of poets. There have only been a handful of poets who have performed at inaugurations, including Robert Frost, Maya Angelou, Elizabeth Alexander, and Richard Blanco. So she really brought a lot to this performance. And when I spoke to her, what was really interesting to me was she felt enormous pressure, not just because of the size of the audience she was going to be addressing, tens of millions of people potentially watching the events at home, but because of the state of the country, she felt a real responsibility to present a poem that reflected Joe Biden's inaugural theme of America United. And she said they didn't give her any specific guidelines, but they said that's the theme of the inauguration. But she also really wanted to address what has happened recently in the country, particularly the partisan divisions that we've seen, the political violence, the effects of the pandemic. It's a really dark moment. And so she was kind of trying to counterbalance those two forces, the potential for unity, but also these deep divisions that we're seeing in the country right now. So interestingly, she was really struggling with the poem. The inaugural committee reached out to her in late December. She had a few weeks to work on it and was kind of, she said, it's like it felt like climbing a mountain. She would do a few verses a day. And then on January 6th, we all watched across the country as the events unfolded at the Capitol. There was the insurrection there and rioters stormed the Capitol. And Amanda Gorman at that point had written about half of her poem, and she stayed up late into the night and finished it because she just felt this urgency. And so there are verses in the poem that reflect what we saw that day. The other thing that she said that was interesting about how she prepared to write it was she said she always starts with historical research. So she studied speeches from leaders who really brought their countries together in times of crisis. She looked at speeches by Winston Churchill, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., And she listened to music that inspired her, including the musical Hamilton. There are a couple of Hamilton references in the poem that some people caught, including Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was very appreciative of her poetry. So it's been incredible to see the response to her work. After she gave this really kind of inspiring performance, her books, she has 2 books coming out this year, actually 3, because they're releasing the poem she wrote as a standalone. And she has now the #1 and #2 books on Amazon. And this is a poet who's 22 years old, and, she's preparing to publish her debut collection this fall. So she's gone incredibly quickly from somebody who had a following and was pretty well known in the poetry world to kind of a national literary star. And one other thing that I loved about her performance and her approach to it was she talked about how she felt like she was representing not just her own words, but representing poetry itself, representing American poetry, and why, it was important to have poetry be part of the ceremony. She said, when I spoke to her, now more than ever, the United States needs an inaugural poem. Poetry is typically the touchstone that we go back to when we have to remind ourselves of the history that we stand on and the future that we stand for. So I thought it was lovely that she felt that she was standing up in front of the Capitol 2 weeks after the insurrection took place, kind of representing poetry as a form that can unite the country.
Well, I really could not put it any better than Amanda Gorman herself. So let's just leave with a couple more lines from that poem, The Hill We Climb. And Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan and Greg Cowles. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
It's been a long time. I feel like this is the OG group, and it's been a few weeks since we've all gathered here. Tina, what have you been reading all this time?
What have I been reading all this time? I have to preface this by saying, as you know, I'm looking for escapist reading. So I sort of went from reading all of Agatha Christie, which, I was reading for a story, and that sort of led me to Rex Stout. And so then I tore through a dozen Rex Stout novels. And that, of course, has led me to food books, which is where I am now.
Which one?
I'm reading Summer Cooking by Elizabeth David. Have either of you ever read any of her books?
No.
Not familiar with her.
She's MFK Fisher-like. Her first book came out in 1950, and it was called A Book of Mediterranean Food. And it sort of grew out of the post-war rationing and deprivation. I mean, the food situation in Britain, even for a few years after the war, was dismal. It seems to me that her writing about food, she was not trained initially as a cook, came out of her yearning for these foods that she was missing and could no longer have. Lemons and almonds, rice, the stuff that we take for granted that you just couldn't have after the war. And so I'm not reading her in order. So I haven't read A Book of Mediterranean Food. Where I started, because I had it at home, because it's a beautiful New York Review of Books edition with a foreword by Molly O'Neill, so Summer Cooking came out a few years later. I'm actually not sure of the original pub date, but these are not cookbooks in the sense that you're reading them to learn how to cook something, at least not for me. You're reading about eating and food and cooking as a pleasure. She's very opinionated. If you like recipes where no story is told and just the recipe is laid out before you, you would not like these books. But I would say that the recipes are really almost incidental and not why you read them. I was going to read you a few sentences from the introduction to the salads chapter, which is where I am now. How one learns to dread the season for salads in England. What becomes of the hearts of the lettuces? What makes an English cook think that beetroot spreading its hideous purple dye over sardine and a spoonful of tinned baked beans constitutes an hors d'oeuvre? Why make the cold salmon, woolly enough anyhow by midsummer, look even less appetizing than it already is by serving it on a bed of lettuce apparently rescued from the dustbin? and on in that vein. Pamela, I feel like you would enjoy her immensely.
Yes, I don't think I will enjoy eating the food she's describing.
Well, no. She's not about that food. Her food goes in the complete opposite direction.
Okay,
but
good.
She's of the James Beard, Julia Child post-war cooking school, the writers who were really striving to push cuisine in a different direction. And it's all about fresh food. I mean, her writing about cheese alone was practically making me drool in bed last night. Anyway, while you might not think of this as conventional escapist reading, it sort of is for me. She cooked in a big, old London, Chelsea basement kitchen. I can just imagine it, with the rafters and the big old wooden table. I don't know.
All right, Tina, I'm going to be totally frank with you. Reading about cooking right now,
yes,
not escapist for me. Not escapist for me. Doing too much cooking.
It's a little too real.
Because you're having to cook every meal. I get it. I guess I just like her sort of persnickety attitude.
Persnickety I like.
Yes.
Greg, what about you? What are you reading?
Well, I've read a few books since I last came on the podcast. I want to mention just a couple of them for very different reasons. One is the novel Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which my daughter gave me for Christmas. I had read a couple of previous Ishiguro books before, The Remains of the Day and The Buried Giant, and liked them both. I like Never Let Me Go, but I want to mention it because it's a book that very famously has a spoiler. And it's essentially a British boarding school novel. It gets very much into the rivalries between the kind of social groups and competing for the teachers' favors. But there's this science fiction hook of a spoiler that comes partway through. I won't give it away for anyone who doesn't know it, but it's so famous now that I knew it going in. And it had me thinking a lot about spoilers while I was reading the book. Would the experience of watching The Crying Game be different if you know what the spoiler there is?
I want to know because I know the spoiler of Never Let Me Go. Does it ruin it?
It does a bit. The structure of the book feels a little bit clunky to me in a way that's driven entirely by Ishiguro's need to hide the spoiler. The narrator is looking back on her years in this boarding school, and so she already knows very much, what the secret is while she's telling you this, but she keeps hiding it from you. And so the structure has this kind of, but I'll tell you about that later, or, that reminds me of something else. There's something very kind of artless about the structure that is actually dictated by the fact that he's holding the secret, and that works against the telling of the story, I think. But then there's just beautiful, lovely moments. He is a real kind of poet of yearning. And if you approach it as a British boarding school novel and kind of a class story, class in both senses, British class system and class education, it's a lovely book. But the spoiler thing, I could have done without it. I think the best works of art, even if there's a surprise in them, that's not the point of it. And here it felt too much like the point of it. The other book that I'm still reading right now and really enjoying a lot is a 1981 book by Tracy Kidder. It's nonfiction called The Soul of a New Machine. This book won the Pulitzer Prize. It won the National Book Award when it came out in the early 80s. And it is a business story. It's a work of immersive journalism about a company called Data General. They were a computer company that existed really only for about 30 years. They folded about 10 years after this book came out, but they were at the cutting edge of what was then called the mini computer market. They had built a 16-bit computer that had kind of made their name, and were now trying to advance to the next generation and build a 32-bit computer. And this book was written to be kind of, wow, look at this cutting edge technology. And it's laughable now you're talking about a 32-bit computer. It's, your iPod was more advanced than that. And now iPods are obsolete. At the time, this really was cutting edge. And it's not a book so much about the technology, although he gets very much into the engineering behind it, and much more about the business mentality and the creator's mentality. It's the electrical engineers who are building this computer and how they work as a team, how they're recruited. So it is a company portrait of a company that no longer exists, where these people are giving their entire lives against long odds to beat the competition for something that by the time the book comes out, is already almost obsolete. They succeed in what they're doing. They create their 32-bit computer. They beat the competition. There's internal competition in the company. There's another team trying to develop the same thing down in a different research park. But by the time the book comes out, IBM has introduced the personal computer and computing goes in an entirely different direction. So this is a whole book about people giving their lives to what is really a lost cause. And as I'm reading it, I keep thinking, I'm a Star Wars fan, and probably most of the audience for this book will be Star Wars fans as well. And it's kind of the Rogue One of the Star Wars, where it's a deep dive and a beautifully artful look at something that is ultimately, if you pull back the camera on this universe, a very small side thing in the development of computers. So they did what they set out to do, and you kind of say, to what end?
I've read some Tracy Kidder, but not this one. Is this like, say, House, in which it's sort of a moment by moment reconstruction?
Very much. I was thinking a little bit about the John Carreyrou book, Bad Blood, because that's also a book about technology and a corporation, and it gets into the kind of corporate structure and leadership and things like that. I also thought a lot about John McPhee, who does these immersive journalism things. And I talked on the podcast several months ago about this John Berger book, Pig Earth, that is about the peasant life. And of course, the technology life is very different from the peasant life, but there's still this sense of giving your all in service of a cause, the passion that made me think of the John Berger as well. Pamela, what are you reading?
I've been reading a lot of books, but I'm going to kind of jump ahead to a book that I read very recently. I still have a backlog, because it reminds me of something, one of the books you talked about peripherally, which is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. That's one of the rare instances in which I watched the movie and then went and read the book, which I don't usually, it's like a trajectory I don't often follow. But I did follow it for the book that I want to talk about this week, which is Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption by Bryan Stevenson. So again, weirdly, I watched the movie a few weeks ago, and it has a really excellent cast, notably Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan, and also Rob Morgan. And so after watching the movie, I went back to read this book, which came out in 2014, and it obviously was a huge deal at the time. I think it's basically been on our bestseller list ever since. And therefore, I resisted it in the way that I often resist books that are overwhelmingly popular, for like years and years. Like, I remember when everyone was reading A Civil Action, and I felt almost like offended by the idea of reading it as well. So it wasn't until about like 10 or 15 years later that I read it. And so everyone, you'd be sitting on the train with a book like that, and you felt like any minute someone was going to reveal the spoiler for you or tell me the ending. And I was the only one who somehow managed not to know. For the few people who still haven't read it, Just Mercy is by Bryan Stevenson, who is a Harvard-educated lawyer who, after graduating from law school, goes down to Alabama and works on behalf of people on death row. And it's a book really about mass incarceration and the death penalty, but ultimately it's a book about compassion and mercy. So with Just Mercy, it's odd to finish this book right now because I feel really evangelical about it. And I feel like everyone where I'm like, you've got to read this book. They're like, we know. We've read it. We read it years ago. What took you so long? Have you read it? Have either of you read this book?
Yes, but a long time ago at this point.
I read it when it came out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So so I don't know. I'm assuming you're going to understand how I feel about this book, which is that I feel like it should be required reading.
It should be part of the curriculum.
It should be
Absolutely
part of the curriculum. And, I was probably the most annoying parent for the entire time that I was reading it because I kept sitting my kids down and being like, now just listen to this, or just read from this part until this part. Okay, now let's talk about it. I forced them all to watch the movie, and hopefully they will read the book as well. But I think it's an interesting book to read right now because it really asks something quite difficult of all readers and of all Americans, which is, of course, to be merciful and compassionate and empathetic rather than punitive and vengeful against those we consider to have done wrong. it's easy, depending on what your politics are or your temperamental disposition, to sort of say, well, I completely understand it, say, for mentally disabled people who are on death row, for example, or women who are incarcerated for life without parole due to minor drug arrests, or people who are sentenced at the age of 13. But then again, depending on your politics, you might then turn and say, well, what about the people who rioted in the Capitol last week? If your politics are on one side, like, how merciful are you in those instances? So I just think it kind of forces you to really think about the extent to which we are empathetic and not vengeful, the extent to which we want punishment rather than forgiveness and rehabilitation, and sort of what that looks like. And I think the specifics in this book, never mind the contemporary parallels, but I just had to bring that up. I mean, the specifics in this book around the injustice of the justice system, around mass incarceration, around the way in which we treat people who don't have resources or adequate protection under the law, and the way that the law brutally is turned upon them. It's just completely horrifying. And again, I'm not going to read the entire book aloud on the podcast, though I'm tempted. I just want to bring up two quick things. One is a line that really has stuck with me that I just, again, think everyone should think about, which is, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And in an era in which, again, we're very focused on punishing and denouncing and canceling and calling out, it's just something to think about. The other is a story he tells very late in the book. I imagine you both remember it. It's an instance where he's a child. He's about 10 years old, and he's at church with his friends, and his mother is there, and a boy who has a speech impediment comes up and says something or attempts to say something, and Bryan Stevenson laughs. And his mother pulls him aside and is absolutely, not just furious, but so gravely disappointed in him. He says the look on her face was a mix of horror, anger, and shame. And she asks him, tells him really, not only to go over and say that he's sorry, but then to give him a hug, which, now he's really feeling pretty uncomfortable and awkward. All his friends are there. And then more than that, to go over and tell him that he loves him. And he does that. And you just have to read it. Do you remember that moment?
I do.
I remember this book came out around the same time as the kids' book Wonder, which got made into the movie and was this monster success. And it had a similar origin story to it of the author. Is that
R.J. Palacio? Yep.
The Palacio seeing a physically deformed child in an ice cream parlor and staring and feeling horribly ashamed about that, or her daughter was staring, or, there was this moment of singling out the other and the shame that comes from kind of this lack of justice. And when I read that in the Stevenson, I thought, it's like that thing in Wonder.
All right. Well, I'm just going to end that by saying, basically, if I had all listeners sort of in front of me right now, I would hand you a copy of this book. That's how strongly I feel about it. Let's run down the titles of what we each read again. Tina?
I read Summer Cooking by Elizabeth David.
I read Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro and The Soul of a New Machine by Tracy Kidder.
And I read Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption by Bryan Stevenson. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.